Hello folks, this is Gary Garrett, and this video is all about how to build really solid anatomical form on top of the simple leg forms that I've showed you in an earlier video. One of the main objectives of this video is to show the dynamic action of the muscle anatomy and how to build on top of the simple volumetric forms I built in previous videos. So I'll speed up the video a little bit to show you the skeletal understructure that I use to kind of place all these forms on top of. It's very important to show this in relationship to where those muscles will attach to, so you'll be able to squash and stretch and get their action and then relate that to tone, volume, and line. So one of the important points here is that I'm making sure that it's in proportion, that all the forms are working together, all those points of contact, all are in proportion before I start to put on any of the forms. So I'm going to make the knees one of the real important focal points of this. One of the reasons for it is that's where all the tendons overlap. There's no muscle that really overlaps the bone there. So it really shows up, and you'll be able to see where those tendons sort of strap onto everything and pull and stretch the forms that are going to be attached to them. I'm using Michael Hapton's book for reference on this, and you can see the different angles of that kneecap, and it's very important to kind of learn that in different directions so you can be more fluid in your approach. So I moved over to more of a close-up when dealing with the kneecap and showing you how simplified I make it, just turning into a basic box. I'm using the blue as showing where the skeleton actually comes out to the surface and influences the way the lines and the marks are going to be in the future. You can see I'm keeping the forms really simple and understandable, and not getting too much into the idea of the details of the actual anatomy. That way, when I make those really quick moves in my quick figure drawings, I can make those choices right on the dime, move real fast. To me, it's much better to simplify it and understand it, so when you have to draw real fast, or you have to make these judgments about where the form is that the contact points of the tendons and the muscles are very understandable. You might see that I'm also making my own adjustments to the source material and opening up a little bit more room between the head of the femur and the tibia, just to sort of show that gap in there. That'll affect the line and the tone later on in the drawing. So now I'm about to move into putting the tendons on top. And that's important because that's going to show you where the stretch is. And so I'm still making little adjustments and showing where those attachment points are in the bone. Little accents, little darker lines means that the bone's coming to the surface a little bit more. So remember, this is information that's going to be very fluid. You won't end up putting all of these tendons and all these marks in every drawings, especially quick sketches. But it certainly will be landmarks and different kind of methodologies that you'll be using to get a better handle on what you'll be drawing. And what's more important is what it will look like. One of the important parts to keep in mind is all these marks you're going to be putting down will represent different kind of strategies and different kind of forms in light and dark and shadow. So I'm moving on to more of a structured form in the foot, making sure that it definitely touches the ground plane. You don't want those feet floating in the air. You definitely want them to be planted and secure so it helps with the balance of your figure. For this back foot, I'm using the Burton Hogarth reference, but as again, you can see I'm simplifying and making sure that it works for me, and more importantly, works for the entire drawing, because it's got to seamlessly match everything else that's in it. One of the last little points I do is make sure that I pull it back to the other foot and measure it to make sure that it has the right placement. Now at this point I'm moving back up to the hips, the pelvis area. Even though I can't see a lot of it in the photographic reference, I definitely make sure that I get that span across there to make sure the volumes work. Because that's what I'm going to be attaching those simple tubular forms to, and then attaching the anatomy to. That's the trochanter I just put in that little round area. Now we're jumping back into the whole form again. You can see from the reference. You can also see the marks that I'm putting down. There's a lot of indication on the kneecaps, up by the pelvis, and down at the foot, again where the bony section comes in. So now what I'm doing is I'm simply angle setting and measuring the bigger forms. So before I launch into drawing a lot of complicated anatomical stuff, I'll have the proportions right. So now I have the proportions pretty much set up. The width to the height ratios, the lengths. I'm launching into these tubes, these really light forms I'm putting on. That's going to be my guide at what direction I'm going to be looking into the forms and how the forms will bend around that skeletal structure. You also might notice that I haven't hammered in the outside contour line. I'm still readjusting and adding and subtracting from the major forms. The main reason for that is that I don't want to jump on the outside contour line. I want to give myself enough room that I can add more dynamic marks and dynamic forms over the top of this structure that I've built. So now I'm getting ready to launch into putting the muscular forms into it. You can see the diagram on the left. What I'm doing is I'm simplifying a lot. I'm drawing like teardrop shapes, saddles, bicycle seats. I'm using any kind of morphed form I can think of to make it easier for me to adjust to what I'm looking at. You also might notice that I'm not rendering any certain section out, is that I'm making sure I'm sort of gesturing in all the different groupings of muscles before I commit. That way, again, my whole design will work rather than just having stringy muscles or separated form. One of the most important points to get across on this is, again, you're adjusting this to the individual model, to the actual person that you're looking at. So you're looking at the squash and the stretch of the muscles, where they're pulling, where they're going around, where they're whipping around from one form to the other, and the overlapping to show more volumetric form. Another little technique you may notice that I'm not just building one line, I'm actually building up a series of lines to show the roundness of the form, the stretching of it. I just added that little curve down there for the belly of the muscle, and coming into the tendons, which are straighter, and then making sure that the form looks a lot more organic rather than just outlined and flat. Now I'm moving back into the kneecaps, making them stronger, making them a lot more as a counterbalance to the soft tissue or the softer belly of the muscles, the rounded areas, that I want to go for more of a square, more boxy look. And again, it's a little bit on the diagramical side. You can see the transparency in there, but the idea is that you can see that interplay between all those different lines and tones. The build-up in it is very linear at this point, but remember, what you're doing is you're leaving yourself tracks for where the shadows would be, depending on what the light's going to do. And it'll make for a much more dynamic shadow pattern and a much better overall design. So at this point, I'm moving up more into the upper part of the hip, kind of building that up a little bit, kind of accenting the inside corners. Now really kind of accenting the outside contour line and bringing that more into the mix a little bit more and giving it a lot more solidity. Now I'm going to move into the lower legs and draw the ellipses again to give myself a guide of how the forms are going to whip around the edges and show a lot more volume and a lot more form. And then when I attach the muscle forms to it, it'll be a lot more dynamic and a lot more action-filled. So the lines I'm putting down right now is basically kind of showing the border in between the muscles. And you can see in the diagram there's a lot of very individual sort of muscle strands in there. And what I'm doing is combining a lot of things and then making sure that it flows up into the upper leg rather than just becoming a flat chart. Now, one important thing to keep in mind is that I am sort of moving from the upper leg to the lower leg just because it's a demonstrational video, so you can see how all the components work together. But what's more important is that as you draw quickly or as you draw with the information, that you unify all the pieces so they all work together. So I've given enough attention to the left leg, and now what I'm going to do is move on to the leg that's in the background. Since it's in the background, I'm going to use a little bit more atmospheric perspective on it, draw a little bit lighter with a little bit less information in it. So though that I'm giving it less information, what I still am doing is I'm making sure that I go cross contour around the forms, again reinforcing the idea of the volumes that are there. So when I'm doing lines that go down the leg, I'm also doing ones that go around it, so they work in concert with one another. Remember though, even because of this demo, I have to sort of tackle one section of the leg and even one leg different than the other one. What's important to remember though is to make sure that the whole design is unified. So you may want to actually sketch in a lot more of the entire unification of everything first and then come in. And so what I'm doing right now is just accenting little things like where the tendon is, adding a little bit more curve to the back of the leg, adding a little bit more form here and there. So at this point, it may look like I'm doing small readjustments, but these are some of the most important ones, because now what I'm doing is like accenting core shadows or where the corner of the form is, bringing out a little bit more attention to certain areas, even sort of erasing maybe some areas to bring a little less attention to them. Now, as we come to the end of this, is that I'm doing these last little accents on where the bone is, keeping the transparency in there. I will tackle shadow later on in a later demo. But again, this shows you like how the muscles were attached. Those groupings will influence more of a volumetric, more shadowed, shaded drawing in the future. But at this point, this is good. What it does is it shows you where the attachments are. It shows you sort of the visual anatomical dynamics and what you can do with the drawing. Because remember, one of the main objectives here is that you'll be using a live model in the future. And what I'm doing right now is just showing you where the overlaps are, where the changes in line quality are, where sometimes the forms collide, like how the foot sits on the ground, ankle overlaps, little core shadow, and I'm even bumping up the Achilles tendon at this point, showing where that tension is, where the boniness of the ankle sticks out. So I think one of the important points about those little arrows I'm putting in there is that shows where the form's turning, like say where the stretching of the upper leg muscles fits into the hip, and where the gluteus muscles turn the corner there, and where the core shadows are and such. But mainly those pivot points, like where I'm showing you at the kneecap, the overlaps. If you change it into just one outside contour line, it's going to be very flat. If you change your approach from thick to thin line, to lines that collide, core shadows, it'll give you much more of a volumetric approach to your drawing. So at this point, I'm just going to do a 5-minute long little gesture drawing, if you have, of the entire form using the same methodologies that we just talked about, but in a sped up version, simplified down to the way it would be practiced in, say, a life drawing workshop or in a classroom. You'll see how I take all of that information from the previous part of the video and then again refine it down to very, very simple methodology using some of the same more complex ideas that we talked about earlier. And as you see, as I come to the end of this, I'm accenting the inside corners. I'm putting more of a line around it. It's not much shading in this, not so much shadow pattern. But again, I'm using the line to show the volumes and the overlaps. So as we come to the end of this, I'm putting a last little accents on it, and the last few little drawings will be drawings that I've actually done in workshops showing the same concepts and ideas executed on the fly in 5 and 10 minute long sketches. So once again, this is Gary Gertz, and thank you very much for watching the video. And there's other ones, so please feel free to go through and take a look at them. And thanks again for showing up. I really appreciate it. Bye.